I'm going to talk for about an hour today, kind of as a prelude to what we're going to be going into for the next couple weeks in here, just so you know. Now, I want to mention, and Laura at least knows about this because she was in here last week, but we had, last Wednesday I think it was, we had the representatives from Colony Brands come in. Again, they have 3 to 4 IT-based internships that they're looking to fill. All right. And they're going to be doing, it's $3,500 a month, plus they end up hiring quite a few of their people that end up interning for them. Now, I've got a list here of some of the stuff that they talked about last time, and I'll post it up there. But again, if you just go out to colonybrands.com, and when I did, under the colonybrands.com, I went under careers, and I picked internship program. All right, and there's where they talk about the different types of internships. Notice there's web developer, and it sounds like, and again, Laura can correct me, and I think Teresa might have been there for this too, I don't remember, but they give you a lot of autonomy. In other words, they give you a project and they go, start working on it. They're there if you have questions, but the idea is that you're given a lot of freedom to sit there and work on this stuff. So like I said, $3,500 a month is nothing to sneeze at. You know, that equates to $42,000 a year. Internships do not get benefits. They mention that. But if you get hired on full-time, you do get benefits. And the 2 people who were here both seemed to really like their job. The one guy was an intern. There was a guy there from HR, and he was brought in about a year ago as an HR intern, and they asked him to stick around. The other guy was a developer who developed for about 20 years in Milwaukee, and for whatever reason decided to move out to Monroe. You know, good, bad, indifferent, whatever. But he sounded like he really liked it. Mark would have liked him because he was all donned up in Packard paraphernalia. All right. So, like I said, if you're interested, go out to colonybrands.com, and this thing that they put here, I will post that by the end of the class period also. All right. All right, everybody hear this? When you're applying for it, you go down to the bottom, and you do what? Career Center. Search for open jobs. So again, if I said web here, and I submit. Now, just so you know, now notice web project analyst. Just so you know, not the web stuff necessarily, but they're looking for programmers too, and they do program in C#. They did mention that. All right, so if I go to web project analyst, job details, yeah, there's a full-time position. All right. But at least you've seen it, so if you have an interest, go out there and go for it. All right. All right. Now, what we're going to do today is basically 2 different things, or one thing depending on your point of view, but we're going to talk a little bit about MySQLi, which we've talked about before, but we're going to talk about it here in terms of using its object-oriented capabilities. Then we're going to go in and we're going to talk a little bit about PDO. And if you want a little bit of information on why you should be using PDO, I found this article also. A little dated, it's about 3 years old, but it's pretty good. All right. As always, again, so you're aware of this, as always, there is a folder out there under the 152, 164. All right, there is a folder out there with today's date on it. All right, that's weird. Okay, I didn't ask for that, but I did. Okay. And what I have done in that folder is I have gone back, and if you remember last semester, we looked at a real simple blog using PHP. I went back, and the procedural is the first one. That's the one we did last year. I went back and rewrote all of it using PDO. All right. we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. What I didn't do, stupidly on my part, is I should have come back and I've got procedural, etc., but I should have had yet a third one here that I don't have. All right, but I should have put this in here that said, for lack of better words, we'll call it combination. And that's basically using MySQLi in an OOP format. I didn't do that. So we're going to go back and look at some of the code, and what I'll try to do between now and Thursday, if I get the chance, is to go back and rewrite this procedural stuff using the object-oriented form of MySQLi. You go, I don't know what you're talking about. That's what these articles, these handouts I just gave you are. All right? So I want to take a little bit of time to go over these. And the other thing that this lecture today allows me to do is to talk a little bit about security, which is probably a topic that's not discussed enough in this program. Again, before he left, I had talked to Doug, and I had actually talked to him about, for lack of better words, maybe even either adding 1 or 2 new courses to the program or changing 1 or 2 courses in the program where we would either team teach them or he would teach them. Well, that idea kind of went up in smoke when he left. All right, and I will give you what I know about security, but it's good full of thimble as far as what he knows. So the first handout that I gave you is this MySQLi for beginners. Again, I stands for improved. Okay. Now, you'll still see a lot, and when I say a lot, I mean that. A lot of code out there that will use MySQL underscore, whether it's MySQL underscore connect, query, whatever. All that stuff has been deprecated by PHP. And again, we've talked about this before, but if you don't remember what deprecated means, it means that at some time, PHP wants to drop all support for it. The problem with that is a lot of places are still using the old-fashioned, old fandangle. This is pre-PHP 4. And since 4, they've had 4, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, 5.6, and they're going to totally skip PHP 6, and they're going right to PHP 7. But there are still a lot of places out there that have very old PHP that they're using. So you shouldn't use this. So the author says here, you should be using the MySQLi. I'm not going to click this, but if you click the hyperlink, you'll get the manual page from php.net. If you go here, you'll get the manual page for PDO. All right? And they mention here, each has its advantages and disadvantages. Well, one thing that PDO does, and we'll talk about that in a second, that's the second handout that I gave you. PDO, which stands for PHP Data Objects, works with not just MySQL. In fact, that other article that I guess I just closed, I wanted to show you that because it mentions the 12 different databases that PDO works with. I'm not going to go through any of these, but you can see them right here. And really, I won't go through all of them, but a couple of them. SQL Server still works with MySQL, works with a lot of Oracle stuff, and it works with something called Open Database Connectivity, ODBC, which allows you to use even non-databases. So you could have comma-separated variable files, spreadsheets, etc. All right, all we'll say about that. So they go through a lot of different stuff in here, and what I want to show you is, again, this is referred to, the stuff they show in this example, this is referred to as object-oriented MySQLi. All right? So you see how it's done here. You create a connection, localhost, ours would be root, there'd be no password, and that would be the name of your database. So you've seen that kind of stuff before. But this, right there, that line that you see in gray that's near the bottom of the screen where it says if $DB -- greater than connect _ error number, what that means is you're attempting right here to connect to MySQL and connect to the demo database. If for some reason you can't, either you can't connect to MySQL via PD, or you can't connect to MySQL, or you can't connect to that database, you'll get an error number. So if that's the case, your error numbers will be greater than 0. So if that's the case, die, which means just get the heck out. And it'll say unable to connect the database, and this right here will show you the exact error that MySQL returns. Okay, so we've looked at these kind of things already. Assuming that you were able to go into it, all right, then you can go in and start doing some querying. Now, this brings up another thing that I really didn't get into with you, but it's at least something you should hear. When you see something like that, where you get the less than sign, less than sign, less than sign, and then afterwards you get something that's typically in uppercase, and then you get something like that which ends it, that's called a here doc. And what a here doc allows you to do is you can take as many lines as you want and put them on as many lines as you want in between this and this. And it's handled by the system as though it's one line. And with a here doc, it says, oh, you've got a backtick in there. So that means that there's a field in there called users. Or, I'm sorry, a table called users, and that says that there's a field in there that's called live. What you can do with here doc is you can put in as many double quotes and single quotes as you want, and it'll handle it all for you. Some people love here doc. It's the old joke that people either swear by it or swear at it type of an idea. So if you want more, you can go into the PHP documentation and look up here doc. There's also one that's called now doc. But here doc supports double quotes and single quotes. Now doc only supports single quotes. Do you need to care about it? No. But you may see it if you go into, or if you interview for a PHP coding job, they may ask you if you know what here doc is. All right. So this is attempting to write a simple query. Select star from users, all right, where live equal 1. Again, you may or may not have noticed this, but a lot of times when you use, for example, like PHP-MyAdmin, it'll put those backticks in there for you automatically. Because what PHP-MyAdmin does is it goes in and it says, oh, I recognize this, and I recognize that's a table name. I recognize that that's a field in that table. So it automatically puts that stuff in for you. It still works without it, all right? But it's something that the software puts in, and sometimes what you'll find is developers put those in also. And they're the backtick, also called a grave accent, and it's right underneath your escape key near the upper left-hand corner of your keyboard. All right? So again, this says attempt to do this select statement. If for some reason it didn't work, that's the not that they put in there. You do another die that says there was an error running the query. So in both the first example we looked at and this example, we're assuming that if they don't work, you're dead in the water. All right, that's why they're doing the die right there. All right, if that line wasn't hit, in other words, if the if statement wasn't true, now as it says, you've got a variable that's called $result that holds a MySQLi result object. You can't directly print out that object because if you do, usually what it'll give you is a number. It's actually called a MySQL resource variable. All right, but you can manipulate it. You can do different things with it. All right. So, as an example, if you go through and do this, this calls the fetch ASOC, which is short for associative array function. So that will loop through the entire table that you just threw into your object, and it'll print out each row. So it'll print out the value for the row, then a line break, then the value for a row, then a line break. Does that make sense? And in this case, the only thing we're pulling out from there is the username. You could pull out as many things as you wanted from here. So if, for instance, and I think you all get this, but let's assume that when we did this, there was more than just a username in here. All right, so you could print out a username. Let's say, for example, I don't know. Let's just assume that they had their job listed in there. Does that make sense to everybody? So in that case, it would print out the person's username followed by whatever their job was. You can print out as many things as you want to print out in here, or as few things as you want to print out. All right, but the key thing is this. And it allows you to use it as though it's an associative array, as opposed to a numerically indexed array. We've talked about that before. All right. When you run a query, one of the things that this result object contains is a variable that's called num_rows. And the reason that you might want to use that is if you write yourself a complex enough query, typically when you do inserts, you insert a row at a time. Does that make sense to people? And you do that because it's real easy to screw something up and you don't want the bad data to get into the system. So even if you put it into a loop or into a file or whatever, you typically do it a record at a time. However, when you do updates or when you do deletes, I might be updating an entire department that works for a company. That department may have hundreds of employees. I don't want to do those one at a time. If everybody who works in shipping gets a 25-cent an hour raise for whatever reason, all right, then what I can do is I can check afterwards, and if I know there's 100 people in the shipping department, I can echo this, and it should equal 100. Okay, that kind of an idea. And I should mention, too, that when you run this, notice it's query. That is the name of a built-in MySQLi method. It says we want to run a query. When you get done with this, the author says here, and he pushes this because it's the same author for both of these handouts, that you should free up the resources when you're done. If you don't free them up and you close out of the program, they're automatically freed up. The problem is what ends up happening with a lot of people is they don't write this, where they call free, and their program just continues along its merry way. And if the program runs forever, technically you're never freeing up that memory. All right? But by just saying this, free, as it says, it'll free up some of the system resources for you. Now, we've looked a little bit at this, and they give you another example. I think it's a little bit later. All right, and it says that the reason that you might want, when you insert data into a database, as it says, you want to make sure that single quotes get preceded by a backslash. Okay? In other words, what I don't want to have happen is if I'm trying to insert data into a database. All right, so if I say insert into employees, values, all right, and I want to put in there John O'Hara. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. There's going to be a problem right there, and the problem is with this thing. Remember that? All right. The problem is when it sees this, it thinks you're done. And it doesn't know what to do with O'Hara, and it's got that at the end. All right. So usually when you put it in, you'll do something like that, which will put it in the correct way. It'll turn off the special meaning. All right. But sometimes you don't remember that, or somebody else has written it, so you call things like real escape string, and it'll do that for you. All right. Again, it's a preventive type of coding structure to put in. And they say it's used so often that you don't even have to say a real escape string. If you want to, you can use escape string. That I didn't know. They'll do the same thing. All right. Ever hear of this before? I'm asking. How many people have ever heard of what's called a prepare statement before? All right, then it's on me for not bringing it up to you. You end up writing something that looks like this. And it may look a little weird because where it says username equals question mark. The question mark is a placeholder, which means at runtime you'll have to fill it in. All right. The advantage of doing it like this is you're not hard coding in the value right there, the way that we've oft times done it. So it's a little bit more secure than hard coding in values. If you do it like this, then there's work that you have to do, because as it says, the question mark is where we're going to be assigning. So they say as an example, let's say we want to look for the username of Bob. All right. Well, if we do this, an advantage of doing this is, what if I have a drop-down list of all my usernames? And I don't know until oh, that's right, it's Bob. That's the username. But until I actually see a list of the usernames, I might not know what user I want to see. Does that make sense? So in other words, you want to configure this at runtime. So that's what they're showing you how to do right here. When you do this, there's more work involved. All right? So they come in here and they set up a variable that's called name, and it wouldn't have to be set up like this. Again, it could be a drop-down list that you picked. It could be anything else. Then once you do that, you have to do what's called bind that parameter, which is $name, by calling the bind param. The S right here means it's a string. So there's more work. It's ugly, but it's considered much more secure, and there are many places that's the only way they'll do things. All right. In fact, here's another example. Notice they're binding 3 fields here. It's name, height, and age. And notice what they put inside of the single quotes here. S string, right, S string for name, D double for height, I int for age. Now you could say, well, geez, why did they put a double in there for height? I think they just did it that way to show you that you can put different types of variables in there. That's all. Then when you run these, it's real simple. Yes. You put SII. Yeah, you can't leave it off. Yeah. You've got to bind every single one, and you've got to tell the type. And that type has to map up with whatever type is actually in the database. Yes. Yes, you can have as many of these as you want or as few as you want. All right, but yes, they have to be the right type, and you have to bind for all of them. All right, there are no shortcuts. Yes. These are the parameters right here. These are the types of each parameter. All right. Then when you run it, you call the execute statement. All right. Why am I even showing you that? Because that's an execute. Earlier we looked at a query. The query statement is the one you run for selects when you're not changing the data. The execute is for when you run when you are changing the data via either an insert or an update or a delete. Finally, they come in here and they talk about transactions. You may or may not remember these, but we did talk about them last semester. And I gave you the example where a transaction is a unit of work that's looked at as one collective unit. So let's imagine that I work for an insurance company, okay? And I've got an insert where I'm trying to stick in a new record for a person, okay? I've got an update already on that new record I'm trying to insert because that person they just got married. So I want to change their marital status. Okay, I've got to delete on a record because I want to delete the old record because it's got a different address, a different name, etc. for the same person. All right, so I have an insert, an update, and a delete I want to do together. So I put them as a transaction, and if I put them as a transaction, they're one unit of work. And either all 3 work, or if any of them fail, the whole thing fails. All right, and that's the idea behind a transaction. And you use stuff like this all the time, whether you realize it or not. You know, I see people drive up to the ATM, go and get a little envelope, stick the money in the envelope, and they stick it right in the ATM, right? You've seen that kind of thing probably before. Maybe you've done it. But the point is, so you're making a deposit. You are assuming that by the next day, probably, you can start to write checks based on that. All right? And if for some reason you couldn't, you're kind of hosed. All right? So it is looked at as basically one big transaction. Now, when you do this, notice the first thing that they're doing. They're turning off auto commit, and the thing that's important to tell you about this is just so you know, in case you didn't, all right, that if I'm coming in here And I'm just going to quickly start up XAMPP. One sec. And I just want to show you this, and then I'll take your question. But when you do this, and I bring this up, and I bring up MySQL minus uroot, anything that I type in there, any insert, any update, any delete, boom, as soon as I hit enter, if it works, it automatically commits. Automatically. But I think it's AU commit equals 0. We'll see if I'm right or not. No. All right, I know it might be set. But there is a way that you can take auto commit and set it to 0, which turns it off. All right, you want to always turn it off before you run a transaction. Yes. As far as what? Well, you're going to end up there. You can take any field that they want to be working with, and you can automatically encrypt it. You're going to be encrypting all that stuff. I mean, anything that's at all personal, you're going to be encrypting, and you're going to be making sure that when you run all that stuff, you're going to be using a post as opposed to using a get. All right. There is nothing that's totally secure. If somebody wants to and digs in it long enough, if I know, let's say I've got a vendetta against you, and I can get some information about you, even if it's encrypted, if I do nothing but work on that 24/7, so to speak, I might be able to break it, no matter how good the encryption is. All right. All you're trying to do is, they've done studies, and they found out that just putting that kind of stuff in there, using post and using SHA or any of these other types of mechanisms, doing that is going to immediately stop between 90 and 99% of hackers. So it is. It's set auto commit equals 0. That's it. Now I can make as many changes as I want, and until I type in the word commit, those won't be written to the database. All right. And if I want to turn it back on again, that's it. So again, this is just a little primer, and they give some pretty good stuff in here. No, the only time you're typically going to turn this on is if you are working with transactions. Now, if I'm working with just inserts, no, I'm going to have auto commit on. I want them to work. All right, but what I'm saying is if I do a bunch of jobs that I'm sticking together, it equates to what I mentioned earlier to you. It's like a batch file. That I want these 5 things to be linked together. And if number 1 works, 2 works, 3 works, 4 works, 5 doesn't work, but 6 works, the whole thing fails. That's when you would turn auto commit off. Because otherwise, yes, it'll still give you error messages. Yes, but it's not committing them. No, it's going through and it's telling you whether or not it'll work. But if everything, yes, okay, success 5 or 6 times or whatever, then you can type in commit, then the whole thing works. All right, but it'll keep going, and if there's a problem, it'll still keep going, but it'll mark that there was a problem. And what we're saying there is, in the example I gave, if the delete doesn't work, now that person's in the database twice. All right, like I said, with an insurance company, if somebody changes their name, etc. Right. But that's not even what's important. The important thing is they're in there twice, and they might have the same policy number in there twice, and that might be the primary key. You can't have that. Yeah. So, all right. You can look at it that way, but like I said, yeah, that's fine. But the idea is even more so than running a test. Like you said, it's a batch. It's one big job with a bunch of different components in it. All right. In some ways, it's kind of like, when you're 16 and you take your driver's test. And the person that gives you the test has you do what? Maybe a dozen different things, right? And what are they watching for? Well, they're watching for some stuff that you know about, and they're watching for some other stuff that you don't know about, right? I can tell you, not proud of this, but the first time I took a driver's test, my driver's test the first time, I failed. Part of the reason that I failed, not an excuse, this was stupid. Okay, just stupid. All right. When I took my test, it was in November, late November. It was really, it was a day like this. All right, actually a day closer to what we've been having before this. And he said, okay, now stick, do your hand signals. Okay, well I did them, but I didn't open my window very far. So I just had a little bit of my hand out, and I was doing this and this, and he told me he failed me because of that. Yeah. He said the rest of your stuff was okay, but that's unacceptable. Which I thought was just weird, because I can tell you that I've been driving now, for 40 years. I've never, that I remember, ever used a hand signal. Not in my car. I've driven a motorcycle when I've used a hand signal, but I've never driven a car where I've used a hand signal. No. Well, and they're not in a car. Yeah. But the other thing you might see is if somebody's directional doesn't work. But I see it a lot with cyclists, because a lot of times, especially if it's bright outside, you might not be able to see their blinker. So they're driving and they've got their hand out, which is probably a good thing. All right. So let's take a quick look at the PDO. All right. So it says we've already looked at the MySQLi. That's the first one I gave you the copy of. So he said, now let's look at the PDO. First is the differences. MySQLi only works with MySQL. PDO works with 12 different databases and some other stuff. MySQL, you can use it either non-object oriented or object oriented. PDO, you can't. It's got to be totally object oriented. So when you connect, take a look at all this stuff. Looks a little ugly. It's not really bad when you take a quick look at it. The first one says DSN, which is data source name. And it says here, basically this says I'm using MySQL as my provider. If it was Oracle, there'd be Oracle there, etc. All right? Then it gives you your database name. Then it gives you your host. Do you have to put in all that stuff? Typically, when I've ran it, I've just put in host equal localhost. All right, I haven't put the port number in there. Okay, then you've got your username here, which again would be root for us, our password, which would be single quote, and then notice you put it in a try catch block. Because if you try doing this, and let's say that I put rot in there instead of root, for example, all right, it throws a PDO exception. So normally you put this inside of a try catch block. All right, and if you can't connect, typically it's bad enough that your host. It doesn't make any sense going on. All right. It says typically as long as you put in the database driver, so typically if you just put in this, you'll be okay. If you leave the whole host thing off, you're typically all right. All right. But you do still need the username and you still need the password. Now, one of the things that PDO comes with, and this is the last 2 or 3 pages of this second document that I gave you, the PDO how-to, is it comes with a whole lot of parameters. And they mention, it says there, you can go and you can set a bunch of attributes yourself, the error mode exception, etc. I don't know what those are. That's what's at the end of this handout. And it's not all of them, it's just many of the ones that you'd be most likely to use. Then you start using it. Doesn't look very different from what we did before. But again, what you'll find if you work for a company that's big enough is there's a good chance that they're not all just using MySQL. So if you use PDO, you can make MySQL databases talk with non-MySQL databases. That's one of the reasons that it's used. That's one of the reasons that it's popular. All right, but this doesn't look very different from what we looked at before. Now they mentioned that as far as using that num rows that we talked a little bit about before, they say, guess what? Doesn't work with all drivers. That's the bad news. Good news is one of the drivers it does work with, MySQL. All right. And they say if for some reason it doesn't work, you can always use the count function and some of the other stuff that we looked at, geez, back in the 147 class. All right. So you've seen a lot of this stuff already. All right. It'd probably take you a little while to remember it, but you all could remember it. And they're very similar as far as, notice in here it's called a fetch all. This looks real similar to what we looked at before on the other one. But there it was, basically it was a fetch ASOC. So the stuff that's happening is similar, it's just the methods that you're using are going to have different names because they're associated with different relational types of relational days, different types of RDBMSs. All right. Where you've got MySQL real escape string, here you've got something that's called quote. Why did they use that? I don't know. Because they did. You use exec just like we talked about before if you're doing a delete or an insert or an update. Prepare statements are similar, where again you use the question mark, and again they're considered to be more secure. Notice that when you're binding here, you use bind value, but it's a little bit different. You don't have to give the type. All right. There's always going to be little nuances, little differences between any of these. Transactions are pretty much set up the same, and then they ended here on the bottom of page 5 and going on to page 6 with some useful options that you may want to set. All right, and I'm not going to run through any of those. The only other thing I wanted to show you was this. So I'm going to come in here. I've got XAMPP running. All right, so this is the one that we did last year, this procedural one. You may or may not remember. Oops, that's the wrong one. It's in there. Remember this, my site of quotes? So I can come up here and I can say, okay, view all quotes. So there's nothing in there right now. Okay, so I can add a quote. My first quote. But I want to show you before we do this, if I show you my databases, all right, you'll notice there's one in there that's called procedural. That's the one that we're looking at right now. So if I use procedural, all right, and I show my tables, and I can describe quotes. There it is. It's got an ID, the quote, the source, whether or not it's a favorite. And if I select star from quotes, there's nothing in there. Should make sense. But now I just put in my first quote, source, anonymous. Is it a favorite? Yes. Add the quote. All right. Successfully connected, and your quote has been stored. Well, how can we check that? Because there it is. All right. Now, if I want to go back to that one and I want to update it, I can view all my quotes, and I can edit that quote and say, you know what, I don't want that to be a favorite anymore. All right, so I can update it, and boom, the quotation has been updated. So notice favorite status is 1, but when I run it again, it's now set to 0. That makes sense to people? What we just did there? And in much the same way, I can come back in, I can view all my quotes, I can hit delete, and it'll say, are you sure you want to delete this? Yes. All right, I bring it up again, and it's now empty again. Does all that make sense? This is all stuff that we looked at last semester. And if I bring this up in here, I'm going to be done before, or by 11 at the latest, if not 5-2. So htdocs, procedural, You may or may not remember this, but this is how we connected. All right, just MySQLi connect. I wish I'd gone back and written that object-oriented, but I didn't. And then selecting the database. All right, that's nothing new there. That's all stuff we've looked at. And then what's in here, all right, add quote. So there's the MySQL real escape string, whether or not it's a favorite. There's the query that we're going to run, and there's the actual query itself that we're sticking in the result. So we're attempting to insert something in there. If affected rows equal 1, the insert worked. So you say your quotation has been stored. Otherwise, you give them an error message. All right. And the other thing about this too is when I run this, so that's the add quote. All right, but if I go in here and I run this, all right, so I'm putting it in there like that, and I'm adding the quote. Okay, now you'll notice that when I put that in here and I look, there it is. And it ran the escape string. So what it did was when it went to put it in, it put a backslash before that, but it stored it with the single quote because that's what we'd want to have in there. And the double quotes worked also. The view quotes, not a big thing. That just says, well, there's still quotes. Show me them. Right there. Okay. Log out and log in are just real short little things that allow you to do just that. All right. There's the index. That's the file that comes up from the beginning. I'm not even going to go through that. But edit quote, again, what are you doing when you're editing? Somewhere in here, there's a thing with an update. You already know this. All right. And when you're deleting, same kind of thing, but somewhere in here, there's a select to grab the quote, but once you do it, somewhere in here is going to be a delete. All right. So if you look here, if you look up on the screen here, it's not going to look really much different, but I'm going to come in here and instead of typing in procedural, I'm going to type in here OOP, which is redone. This is redone using OOP. All right. So if I view all my quotes, there is one quote in there right now that says first OOP quote by somebody, and it's a favorite. Well, let's look. So I'm going to use OOP, show tables, there's quotes, select star from quotes. There it is. First OOP quote, somebody, and it's a favorite. All right, you can see I did this the other day. All right, but it works the same way. I can edit a quote. I can come in there. Changed everything that was in there. Oh, it doesn't like something. And I think maybe I didn't do a good enough job of fixing that. So let's look. All right. So I didn't handle that single quote. But let's see what's changed in here. First OOP quote, dang, it's good, somebody else. So I'd have to go back in there. So there's an error in my code right now. All right. So I can view all quotes. I can edit an existing quote. I can view and I can delete an existing quote. And you'll notice that it's gone. But the key thing to realize when you look at this is that's the procedural side, so I want to show you this quick from the OOP side. First, you'll notice when you look here, this is different. I set it up the same way they showed it in the book. I did set my host up, but I set it up to 127.0.0.1, which is just my machine. All right, I could have said localhost also, but I tried them both, and they both worked. All right, the username, the password, and again, inside of a try-catch block, as was recommended in there, set it all up. All right? And if you look at the rest of it, there's the add quote. All right, it's more than anything else. It's what I had to do is change a lot of things syntactically in here. And in here, where I did this, previously they had the show it to you. In here, I took out these lines because that's not supported in PDO. But what I should have done is, before doing this, I should have come back in here and done something like this. All right, the chances of this, of what I'm showing you right here, working, probably aren't going to be very good, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. Remember, quote has nothing to do with the fact that this database is called quotes. Quote here has to do with the fact that I'm trying to add quotations. All right, let's see. Need that. All right, like I said, this very well may fail, but I'm trying it anyway. What the heck? Well, I cut the errors down, but it says call the undefined function quote. No, that is a defined function for PDO, but I'd have to go back and take a look at it in the handout that I gave you. All right, sorry about that. See if I can fix that too if I get time. No, I didn't put it in. We could have put it in. This is such a little putty database that I didn't. It would have been better to put it in. Yes. Yeah. I guess what the error is here is I'd have to say I'm not sure if this is going to fix it or not either, but we're going to try it. All right, so there's the quote. Oh, made it worse. Nice and colorful though. All right. But if you look your way through here, you could look at the add quotes between the two of these. Wish I'd have done a little bit better job of testing it, but I didn't. Okay, but what I did show you in here, for instance, here's the view quotes, and here's how you could use the PDO fetch ASOC. All right, here's the edit quotes, and again, the PDO fetch ASOC, the delete, and the same thing. So it works more than it doesn't work. The only problem is right now, it doesn't like the way I'm putting those quotes in there, so I'll try to fix that. And in fact, I'll try to do this before we get done with class today. I'm done lecturing, but I'll see if I can fix that, and if I can rewrite this procedural one using the OOP stuff also, and I'll put it out there. And that'll be the one I'll put out. I'll have one that'll be called Today's Date Final, and I'll put that out on the P drive, and I'll put that out on Blackboard. All right. So what we're going to do Thursday is we're going to start looking at this project. But to me, you're not going to have to turn it in. Just so you know, the stuff we're going to be doing for the next 2 or 3 weeks, you will not have to turn in. Can everybody shake their heads up and down to tell me that they heard that? Okay. All right, everybody who knows how to shake their... But with a lot of it, I've had to do a boatload of typing, so I'm going to give you hard copies. So if you want to key it in, you can. All right? But since I had to key it in, I'm going to have you key it in. But you don't have to key it in if you don't want to. All right? And that's the end of the lecture.